Good evening. Can you hear me? Okay, yeah, that sounded like a no. Based on your response there, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, very good. We'll be here with you this evening. I'd like to say thank you for the opportunity to come over here and be part of this gospel meeting. I'd also like to say that it's nice of you to invite me because you couldn't get Tim Hall, you couldn't get Tom, you couldn't get Jack Hall, and so you have me. So thank you very much. But I will say this also, at least I was a step above Mike Johnson. He doesn't even have Hall in his name, so he barely qualifies to be part of this meeting. But this evening, if you will, open up with me to Exodus chapter 1. Exodus chapter 1. And that's going to be our text for this evening. And I'm going to say two things as we get started. Number one, I'm going to give you a quote. And it's a quote that you may know or you may not. But the quote is this, that freedom is fragile, and it is never more than one generation away from extinction. So if you know the quote, then you know who said it. And if you don't, then I'm going to tell you it was Ronald Reagan that says that quote. And so when he mentions that freedom is fragile, and he gives this implication that it's not more than one generation away from extinction. Certainly that's true in some political sense or in some national sense. But of course, we're concerned with spiritual things. So what we're going to look at is the idea that not just freedom, but instead Christianity, while in one sense is the strongest, most resilient force in all of the world, in another sense it is fragile, at least in a generational way. A local extinction. The other thing I'm going to tell you is this, that I am, if you go back through my mom's dad's side of the family, you keep going back that way, then I am the 8th generation of New Testament Christian. Now that is pretty impressive, and I don't think there's a whole lot of people that can go back quite that far. And so that puts that generation, that first generation, very near the restoration as it takes place. And so that's a wonderful thing, a great thing, a thing to be proud of. But at the same time, what a shame it would be if I am the last in that line. Again, it's never more than one generation away. This evening, like I said, we're going to be in Exodus chapter 1. We're going to start out with a little bit of background here. And the most basic background we can give is that Exodus is written by Moses. And Moses writes not just Exodus, of course, but he writes the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And he writes these things after they take place, at least some of them. We know, of course, in Exodus, at least the beginning, that he is writing after the fact because he's yet to be born until chapter 2. And he's certainly not penning the book of Exodus as he floats down the Nile in a basket. So he's writing much later on about these events. And in the end of Genesis, which really is a continuation into Exodus, he has just covered the death of Jacob and then the death of Joseph. And he's going to touch on the death of Joseph again here as well. And so Joseph is the last of what we consider to be the patriarchs. And Joseph is about to die off and his whole generation. But as we get into that, starting with verse 1, it says, "Now these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. Each man in his household came with Jacob." Verse 2, "Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, and all those who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, for Joseph was in Egypt already." So this is the story of who came to Egypt in the first place. And we remember that after this point, the Israelites will be enslaved. But up to this point, it's just these 70 people, and that's it. And really, that's the entirety of what will become the nation of the Israelites. So they enter into Egypt, just these families, and in verse 6, things start to change. In verse 6, it says, "And Joseph died." Well, that's a big change by itself. Joseph is the first one in Egypt. Joseph is the one that's in power in Egypt, and he dies. But then it says beyond that, all his brothers died, and all that generation, meaning even his brothers' wives, everyone of that age is now gone. That first generation has died. Now, I'm going to tell you something that may be startling to you if you've never thought about it before, but whatever generation you're a part of, if you are a Gen Z or Gen X or a baby boomer or a millennial, your generation and everyone in it will die. Not maybe tomorrow, not maybe for several years, but that generation will be gone. And everybody that you grew up with that experienced the same things, they will be gone. Eventually that will happen, and that happens here. Joseph and his generation die. Now what's strange though is that Moses, as he writes this, he's not really that concerned with chronology. He's not really that concerned with the timeline, because Moses' purpose not to give you a step-by-step, this is what happened every year. Instead, Moses is concerned with telling the story of how God brought his people out of Egypt. And so he's going to give you a little bit of background, just what you need to know, and then he's going to get into that story. So he's going to skip over several years here. In fact, he's going to skip over a few hundred years in just a couple verses. So just something to keep in mind. In verse 7, it says, "But the children of were fruitful and increased abundantly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them." Now, even if you were just glazed over when you were hearing that verse, you still know what it meant, because it says the same thing about 4 times in 4 different ways. And it says that the population of Israel increased. So it uses the words fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and grew exceedingly. Well, okay, we get the idea that Israel is apparently more than just 70 people, more than just those that went into Egypt. So over the course of time, they grow, and they grow quite a bit. One illustration of that in this verse is this phrase, at least in English, it's a 2-part phrase. It says increased abundantly. But if you go back to the Hebrew, it's just one word. But more specifically, that word is the same word that's going to be used in just a little while during the plagues to describe how the frogs came up out of the Nile. And what it literally means is to swarm, or to swarm up. So the comparison is that the frogs, just as they came out of the Nile, it's the same way that the Israelites just covered the land. They were everywhere. And so their population has increased significantly during this time. And again, this is not just a one-generation event, really, but instead now we're talking about several generations over the course of some 400 years. So if their population increases, then how big is the population? Well, it depends on who you ask, but the best estimates are somewhere between 1 and 4 million people. Now, that may not sound like a whole lot, but in the ancient world, there's not quite as large of populations as there are today. And so that's a pretty significant amount, 1 to 4 million, somewhere in there. But the other thing that's interesting, as hard as it is to estimate the population in ancient times, it's estimated with Egypt, the Egyptian population was probably only about double that. So whenever the Egyptians start to look at the Israelites, they're not concerned with 1% of their population being Israelites. They're not concerned that 5% of their population are these foreigners that don't worship their gods and don't follow their customs. They're concerned because about 1/3 of the people in the land of Egypt are now Hebrews. Enough reason for concern, not that justifies the actions that they take, but there is a reason that they are fearful there. Sometimes we say there's safety in numbers, and that's true, but sometimes there's fear in numbers. Daniel, if you're walking down an alley and you see one rough-looking character in the alley, you might turn back, but you might be comfortable enough to just walk on by. But if you see 10 rough-looking characters in that alley, you're probably not going to keep going down that alley. And so sometimes if there's enough of a group of people, it's going to change how you view those people regardless of what they do. And so that's the case here. And the fear sets in and things are going to change. In verse 8, things do change. In verse 8, it says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph." That one sentence covers an enormous change in how the Israelites are going to be treated. Before, they were just a group of people that were in the land, and they were tolerated, and people thought, okay, well, that's those people, and this is fine. But all of a sudden, this new king is going to arise, and everything's going to change. But it gives a reason for it, too. It says, because he did not know Joseph. So a couple questions here. The first one, who is this new king? And unfortunately, the answer is, we probably can't be exactly certain who it is. Some people suggest with a limited amount of certainty that maybe it's Seti the first, or maybe it's Ramses the second, or maybe it's some other specific Egyptian pharaoh of that day. But there's really not enough information to go on to be fully precise here, because we aren't told quite enough. But at the same time, some people suggest that maybe it's not just a new king that arises, but instead it's a new dynasty, since it says that there was a new king, not just the son of the old king, but instead a whole new family that has come to power. And maybe that helps to explain why it was that Joseph was being forgotten about at this point. But whoever this king is and however they rise to power, the problem is they do not know Joseph. So the interesting thing to me, though, is that if this is about 400 years after Joseph and his family have come into the land, and at least 300 years since Joseph has been dead, that means Joseph was remembered for most of that time. And that means that his legacy extended well beyond his lifetime and his grandchildren's lifetime. Well, why is that? Well, what did Joseph do? Well, Joseph probably was remembered as the man who saved Egypt, because he did. Without him, the famine would have killed almost the entire land. So without him, the nation wouldn't have been saved. He might have been just remembered as a wise leader in general. Certainly he was. He was also the interpreter of dreams. He was a man that came from nothing. He was a slave that became second in command in all of Egypt. And so there was good reason to remember him. But for some reason, this king does not. And it's possible, like we said, that maybe it's a new dynasty that arises, and maybe they don't remember what happened before. Or maybe it's just an individual who doesn't concern themselves with the history of their own nation, and they say, well, what's it really matter? And Joseph is forgotten about, and everything begins to change. So in verse 10, it says, "Come, let us deal shrewdly with them," that is, the children of Israel, "lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land." Now, as we said, we're not talking about just a few hundred people. We're talking about over 1 million people that probably make up about a third of the whole population. If a foreign country comes to invade and they can convince the Hebrews that they should ally themselves with this invasion force, then what's going to happen to Egypt? Well, they're done for. If this part of the population that's already within your own borders decides to take up arms, that's it. You're done as a nation. So in a certain sense, what they do is shrewd. It is wise. According to worldly wisdom, if there's someone that is potentially in a position to harm you, then it's wise, according to the world standards, to get rid of them. And to destroy them by whatever means necessary. And to us, that probably sounds strange. It sounds foreign, but how long ago has it been that was the standard practice of kings? When a new king would rise to the throne, who would you get rid of? You get rid of your brothers, you get rid of your nephews, maybe even your own sons. Anyone that can take power from you. That's just what you do, because that's according to the wisdom of the world. And so they act shrewdly. They deal this way with the Israelites. In verse 12, it says, "But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were in dread of the children of Israel. And so the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor." They become fearful of this large population, as we've been talking about, and so they decide to enslave. Now, first off, slavery is not uncommon at this time. In fact, slavery has been common across essentially all cultures for essentially all time into the last few hundred years, where it started to change. But they they specify in the text here that they were going to have them serve, verse 13, serve with rigor. Now, that word is specifically interesting because rigor in some sense just means difficulty, or it means harshness. And certainly that's true. They would make these slaves serve in a very difficult way. And these slaves were going to build store cities for the king, and possibly even pyramids for these kings and pharaohs. But that's not really what this word means here. Because if you go back to the original language and you go back to the root of this word, it means to break apart. See, the Egyptians don't really care if the Hebrews help them build extra cities. They don't really need that. What they're concerned with is breaking apart a nation so that it has not enough power to ever cause a threat to them. That's the position that Israel is left in. And why does it happen? Because a new generation arose. And a new king arose that didn't remember what had happened before. That's the text that we want to look at tonight. And that's the text that we want to draw from as far as it applies to ourselves. And so how does this text apply? There's a lot of ways we can break this down, but let's start with another quotation. I've always been a fan of quotes from especially historical figures. The only problem is sometimes you're not 100% sure if the person actually said it. And this is one of those cases. But it's a quote that's attributed to Mark Twain, which take it or leave it. But if it is, or if it's not, the quote is this, and you've heard it before, I imagine. It says that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Okay, so history doesn't repeat itself. It's not usually that history goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 50 years later you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 happen again. But maybe instead you see 1, 3, 4, 2, 5. And it kind of rhymes with what happened originally, not necessarily repeating itself verbatim. But at the same time, we see this in history, and we recognize this in history. And you can look to a lot of different examples. Here's a very common example that's given. What happens, historically speaking, if you have any knowledge of history, what happens when you try to invade mainland Russia? And what happens when winter sets in? All of your troops die from starvation and disease, and you lose the war. It's happened a lot in history. And somehow people keep doing that over and over again. And we can see a lot of different examples in history where this is the case. You can look in American history at the problem of investing with borrowed money. And that sounds like a simple enough problem, but if you go back to the Great Depression, or if you go back to the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, you're going to find the same thing, that people are investing with borrowed money, and eventually the bubble burst, and the crisis results. So we see this pattern unfold, not the exact same repeating of history, but sort of a rhyming of history. And so when we see that, the question is, with these different generations, is what change can happen from one generation to the next, especially if they ignore the rhyming patterns of history. Well, in one generation is all it takes to change the entire course of a nation. And we're going to look at this on the largest scale first, and then we'll work our way down. But starting with this, an entire nation can be changed in just one generation. A different biblical example than the one that we're looking at. If you go forward a little bit into Judges chapter 2, we're going to take a look there. Judges chapter 2. In Judges chapter 2, to set up the situation, we're going to read verse 10 and following. Judges chapter 2, verse 10. Joshua, who has been leading the people of Israel for a long time, has just died. And so we see a very similar situation to what happened with Joseph in the book of Exodus. But after this takes place, again in verse 10, it says, when all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, which is a Hebrew idiom to say that they had in fact died, another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord, nor the work which he had done for Israel. Verse 11 says, then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. Of course, this starts a pattern that's going to continue all throughout the book of Judges, where people slide farther and farther away from God. But how does it start? Joshua and Joshua's generation dies off. After that, they leave everything that's connected them to God, and they serve false gods. It doesn't take long. In one generation, you can go from faithful to unfaithful, from faithful to serving false gods, which is a pretty big step, you would think. But all it takes is one generation. So one generation can change the course of a nation. But on the other hand, I want to keep some positivity in this as well. So on the other hand, what can happen in a positive way in one generation? Well, remember what happens in the story of the scroll being found by the priest Hilkiah whenever the temple's being refurbished. And the scroll that's been found is brought to Josiah, this young king. And what changes? Everything changes. The temple worship is restored. The Passover is actually kept for the first time in centuries. Everything changes in one generation. That can happen too. So just because we look at this and we say, well, the Israelites failed sometimes, one generation at a time, well, sometimes they succeeded, and succeeded greatly within the same time span. So the second thing we can say, though, is that one generation is all it takes to change the course of a family. So this gets it down on a smaller scale. It's kind of hard sometimes to think in national or international terms, but if we limit this to just an individual family, we can see the same thing play out. So specifically, biblically speaking, if you look at the life of David, and then his son Solomon, and then his son Rehoboam, well, what happens? Well, David starts out okay. He has some problem with his own sons, aside from Solomon. And then Solomon does okay, but he really gets a lot farther away from God. And then by the time you get to Rehoboam, things are bad. Things are really bad. And of course, the kingdom is going to be split as a result, and everything's going to go downhill for really the rest of Jewish history after the time of Solomon. And so we have one family. Now, they happen to be the royal family of Israel, but in one family, because people forgot to look back to what God had done for David and for Solomon, everything changes. And of course, the specific instance there of Rehoboam, you'll remember what happens in that story. The people come to him and they say, the taxes are too high. Is that a common complaint among people in a nation? Yeah, generally. So the taxes are too high. Can you lighten our load? And he asked his father's advisors, the people who were older that remembered the last generation, that remembered the history that had gone on. And what do they say? Well, they say, yeah, that'll be better for everybody. They'll like you more. It'll make it easier on them. And eventually it'll work out to where everybody does well financially. So this will be good. And then he says, okay, great. But what do the people that I grew up with say? Well, they say, how about you double down on it? How about you get all the money you can out of these people? And who cares about what's happened historically? All we care about is what's happening now. And so in one generation, everything changes, and not for the better in this case. Most of us have experienced this on a more personal level. How many of you have a family member who has made an eternally short-sighted decision, that they knew the truth and they have left the truth? What does it take? One generation. Now, the problem with that is, though, it doesn't affect just one generation. Whenever they leave the church and they leave the truth, what happens to their children, to their grandchildren? Well, they're never going to know the truth in the first place. It's more than one generation affected, but it happened in just one generation's time. On the other hand, on the positive side of this, what can change in one generation? Now, how many of you instead are first-generation Christians? I said at the beginning that it's wonderful that I can trace back to 8 generations of faithful New Testament Christians, but I also say it's great to be able to trace back 2 generations to my own granddad who chose to become a New Testament Christian. And that lineage still lives on. Even if it's only been a few generations, everything can change in just one, for the positive or for the negative. One generation is all that it takes to change a nation, sure. To change a family, absolutely. but also it's all that it takes to change the course of a congregation. How many of you are aware of congregations of the Lord's church that in one generation's time, and we're talking maybe 25 years, something like that for a generation, that have gone from faithful to the doors are closed? Why does that happen? Well, because things can move very quickly. And all it takes is one generation forgetting what God has done in the past and trying to move beyond that. And they end up being unfaithful, end up with the doors of the congregation closing. That can happen as well. But on the other side of that, what could happen to the church in one generation? What could happen to the church in Stanford in one generation? Let me ask this question. How many generations did it take for the Lord to establish the church on earth? It took one. It took one. From the time that the sermon is preached on the day of Pentecost, go 25 years out from that. How many tens of thousands of Christians have been converted in the Roman Empire? In one generation, the church was established. In one generation, a single congregation could triple, quadruple. It could go exponentially larger in size. It all depends on what we do. Now, with all of this, though, the question, or a question that often gets asked with this, is if we look at the current generation. So if we look at the example that we've been talking about from Exodus chapter 1, then who is at fault here? Is it Joseph's generation? Is it the new king's fault who arose? Who's at fault with this? If we look at the example of David and Solomon and Rehoboam, who's at fault there? Is it Rehoboam's fault? Is it Solomon's fault? Is it David's fault? There's a temptation when we're trying to assign any kind of blame to blame the youngest generation. Have you ever noticed that? Yeah, the youngest generation always did things the worst, and they always got it wrong, and they're the ones to blame. Well, I can say that now because I'm not the youngest generation. Isn't that nice? So the youngest generation, they're the popular target. Well, after all, they're the ones that are getting it wrong right now. So isn't it fair that they are the ones doing it wrong? Well, what if on the other hand, it's the oldest generation? You ever hear the oldest generation get blamed? It happens too. So is it the oldest generation's fault? They're the ones that started doing a lot of things right, but maybe they got some things wrong. And maybe that eventually led to the downfall of this youngest generation. There's a popular trend right now in culture in general. And the trend is to attack the oldest generations. Not just the living generations, but go back even farther. It's started in culture where people go back to the founding of the United States, and they try to tear it down as being illegitimate or as being evil from the beginning. That same trend happens within individual families where children say, well, my parents never did anything for me, and it's all their fault that I ended up this way. And this happens even within the church now. And I promise you, there's a growing movement within the church that says that the church was founded on bad principles, that the church was wrong from the beginning. That's dangerous. But here's the question. If we have developed out of the family that we were born into, if we've developed out of the nation that we're a part of, if we've developed out of the congregations that we came from, then is it fair to blame the originators instead of lumping ourselves in there? Here's the example. In Romans chapter 18, in verse 11, or in Romans chapter 11, rather, in verse 18, here's what happens. Paul is trying to get the Gentiles and the Jews on the same page. And that's what most of Romans is about, trying to fix that problem that's going on. And when he gets to chapter 11, he starts to address the Gentiles for the first time. And so back in verse 13, he starts to actually address the Gentiles. And he says, listen, Gentiles, now I know that you're special and that you feel special because God has now added you in. God has now accepted you as part of this whole kingdom of God's chosen people. But here's what you need to remember. Here's the warning for you. Who were the roots of the tree that God planted? Where did all of this start? Where were God's first chosen people? Well, the roots were founded in Judaism, in the Hebrews, in Israel. Even the first converts to Christianity were, in fact, Jews. And so whenever the Gentiles are now being grafted in, as the analogy is here in chapter 11, when they're being grafted in, Paul warns them to say, listen, just because you're part of the tree now, be careful, because you aren't the root. So in verse 18, he says, do not boast against the other branches, but if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. What happens if I lay the axe to the foundations of the nation that I'm a part of, the family that I'm a part of, the church that I'm a part of? If I chop down that tree without ever considering that I myself am a branch of that tree, then eventually the whole thing is going to fall with me right along as part of it. We are not the roots. The roots support us. The oldest generation supports us. The pioneers within the church support us. We're just the branches that have grown. So is it the oldest generation's fault? Well, maybe that's not fair to say either. But we're still looking for some kind of blame. So let me suggest this. If it's not the oldest generation that's at fault, and it's not the youngest generation that's at fault, then who's left? The generations in between. Now, I can say this now. Since I have a child, I am not the youngest generation, right? I am now one of the generations in between, and so are you. And so will my child be one day. The generations in between are always shifting. As generations move on, as the last generation dies out, we're all the generations that are in between. So when we look at this, though, let me give this analogy for you. Why is it that the youngest generation today, that they don't know how to, why don't they know how to milk a cow? Why don't they know how to change their own oil? Why don't they know how to wire a light fixture? Why is that? Well, is it their fault that they weren't taught? Well, maybe if they rejected the teaching, that's usually not the case. But is it not true that you can go back one or two generations to the point where everybody moved off the farm and where they stopped milking cows at all, and they didn't teach that next generation because, in all honesty, as nostalgic as they are about that cow, they hated it the whole time? You remember that? Okay, so when we look at the generations, we say, well, it's not the youngest generation, it's not the oldest, it's the ones in between. And when we look at David and we look at Solomon and Rehoboam, is it David's fault? A little bit. Is it Rehoboam's fault? Well, he made the choices, so yeah. But whose fault is it? Well, Solomon didn't carry on what he was supposed to do. Solomon did not teach what he was supposed to in spite of being so wise, in spite of the Proverbs that he taught. He's part of the problem, and David is part of the problem as well. So it's those generations that are in between that are going to be the ones that cause the problem. And any group, any body succeeds or it fails dependent on those generations in between. Not the first generation, not the last generation, but those ones in between. What's the solution to this? If we go to Deuteronomy chapter 6, and this is an easy place to turn, but it's an important scripture for us to remember. It is the solution. It's God's solution to this problem. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 6. After giving the command that the Lord your God is one and that he is your God and that you should love that God, verse 6 says, and these words which I command you today shall be in your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children. And you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. And you will bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. In verse 10, so it shall be when the Lord your God brings you into the land to which he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you large and beautiful cities which you did not build. But then skip down to verse 12. Then beware, lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. The generations in between have one job. Their job is to teach the next generation. If they do not teach that next generation, then there is an inevitable result that they will forget the Lord who did the things for them in the past that they couldn't possibly do for themselves. In this case, we're talking about Israel, who forgot that God parted the Red Sea and that their ancestors walked across on dry ground. And today, we can look at it in the exact same perspective for ourselves. We look back to the early days of the church and we say, how did those people possibly come out of the backgrounds that they did to understand that the only way to be a Christian is to be a Christian only according to the New Testament? But they did. And so we go from there and we look today and we say, well, I'm here. But if I don't teach the next generation that the only church worth believing in, the only church worth attending is one that it seeks to restore the New Testament, what's going to happen? Well, then we're one generation closer to extinction. Our job is to teach. And this is not just an Old Testament principle, of course. In fact, this principle is displayed pretty well in the Lord's Supper that we take each week. It's the remembrance that carries us forward, that helps that next generation. But also in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, that's a lot of 2, 2 Timothy 2:2, it says, "And these things that you have heard from me among many witnesses, commit these to faithful men who will be able to teach others also." You hear the pattern there? You've heard it from me. So you take what you've heard from me, that's the first generation. Now you take it, the second generation, you teach it to the next generation that they will be able to teach to the generation after that. And suddenly you're 4 generations removed and there's still faithful truth being taught. So long as it's taught each generation, one generation at a time. This is the same call that we read, of course, in the Great Commission. At the end of Matthew chapter 28, we read, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." Making disciples, teaching them, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. Well, what's the pattern? The pattern is the same. The pattern is always the same. You go with the knowledge that you've been given. You teach, you disciple the next generation, and you teach them to observe all the things that I've already taught you. Well, what did I just teach you? I taught you to teach the generation after you. So when you teach the next generation, what do you teach them? That they have to teach the generation after that. The pattern is there throughout the Bible. This pattern is the only way that the truth will survive. It happens one generation at a time. It'd be so nice if we could just say, well, that generation, a couple generations back, they were so good. They were so right and so true that that'll just carry on. It doesn't work like that. We have to be just as good. We have to be just as diligent to teach it to the generation after this. With all that, here's the invitation for you. Let's start with this. Make no mistake, you will teach the next generation something. You will teach the next generation something. You will show them by example how to be faithful, or you will show them by example that the church isn't really that important. You'll teach them that God exists, that He wrote a book that He wants us to have, that He sent His Son to die for us, or you won't. It makes all the difference, and it only takes one generation. And the question for us is, what will we teach the next generation? Not just the one that we're in, not just will we receive the truth, but what will we teach the next generation? And the more personal question is this: will you be the last faithful Christian in your family? If that's the case, how would that make you feel? If you're going to be the last one in a long line of Christians, or even a short line of Christians, will you be the last one? Tonight, the other option is, will you be the first Christian? Now, I don't know your spiritual state. I don't even know it as well as those around you here in Stanford. But God knows it and you know it. Tonight, will you be the first generation Christian? Knowing not that it just affects you and your salvation. That's wonderful for you to be saved. That's wonderful for you to know the truth. But knowing that it will affect your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren long after you're gone, people will still be following Christ if you became that first generation. And tonight, if you've already obeyed Christ, then the question is, will you teach the next generation? And will you teach them to be faithful? Tonight, if there's anything that the church here can do for you, wonderful. If you've never become a Christian in the first place, this is your opportunity. If you need to know more about how to do that, we are ready to talk to you about it. But tonight also, if there's something that you know that you could do for the church, you've got the opportunity to step up and do it right now. And to say, I'm willing. I want to do more. I want to be more committed. I want to show more love to Christ. And tonight, if there's anything that you need, anything that we can do, come forward now as we stand, as we sing.